over the last 2 weeks? Affordability. Because I've won. I've won affordability.
Let's bring in our Washington Deputy Bureau Chief, Laura Davison. And Laura, I gotta be honest, I almost missed this whole story because we've been so distracted by everything that's happening around Iran. And of course, recently we saw the extraction of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. We're seeing so many other geopolitical concerns at the moment. I wonder if the American public is even paying attention to this. And now the president is declaring victory here. What exactly is it saying?
So you really have a disconnect here about what Trump is saying publicly, saying, look, affordability is solved, we can move on from that. And his advisors and Republicans around him who have to run for re-election really worried about this affordability issue. I can imagine that clip you just showed of Trump saying he won on affordability. Something that Democrats are going to pull and run in campaign ads and show the data, show the concerning job numbers and other issues here that are likely to be some like key issues that we know from voters going into the November elections that they're very concerned about. His approvals, especially on economic issues, are at their lowest levels ever. And this is going to be a huge problem. We see them talking about, whether there would be housing plans or specific plans to roll back the tariffs on steel and aluminum. This is an acknowledgement from at least the lower levels of the administration that these are issues that they need to address. But Trump does not seem inclined to lean into those.
Hey, Laura, can I just pick up on that point as well? I mean, if he's declaring a win on affordability at a time where, given the way oil prices are trending, we could see upward pressure on prices at the pump. Does that also factor into the cost of living pressures for the ordinary American? And what is that going to mean as we head into the midterms?
Yes, that weighs heavily. We've seen inflation kind of really be kind of bumpy and patchy, of having certain areas where prices have come way down, but other areas like in energy and meat, for example, where we've really seen prices continue to soar. Trump campaigned in the presidential election 2 years ago on getting the price of gasoline down to below $2 a gallon. That's highly unlikely to come to fruition. Regardless of any geopolitical situation, but particularly as we see tensions ramp up in Iran, we can see oil prices continue to spike, causing widespread concern about energy prices at the pump as people head into the summer travel season.
Laura, many thanks. Bloomberg Washington Deputy Bureau Chief Laura Davison. Now let's talk about South Korea as well, because former President Yoon Suk-yeol has been sentenced to life in prison after being found guilty of leading an insurrection through his 2024 martial law declaration. Yoon's lawyers have denounced the ruling as politically motivated and vowed to fight until the end. Let's bring in Seoul editor Denny Thomas for more. So, Denny, perhaps as some anticipated, there could be a sort of appeal, and his lawyers talking about fighting to the end. What might such a process look like, and how much longer does this draw out the case?
Yeah, so it's not very clear how long when the fight back will come, but definitely the indications are that they might appeal this ruling. I think clearly a lot of people were expecting a much bigger kind of a penalty as a death penalty. The fact that that did not come through probably is giving the Yoon camp a bit more of a thought whether how should they proceed with this next leg of this legal battle. But as of now, there's no indication they're going to launch a fight back, but it looks like that they might do, just to make the case that they don't agree with what the judge and the prosecutors have done.
And this is going to keep the main opposition party pretty distracted. How does this, in a way, give an upper hand to President Yi and his policies in the country?
So definitely, this is, from that perspective, it's a kind of it draws a line in the sand. Lee and his presidency can now look forward a bit more confidently about not being distracted. On the other side, I think the conservatives are still reeling with this kind of impact of this almost 2-year-old episode, and they're still not coming to terms with the fact that this has happened, and so they have to rally around a new leader, and that process will take until such time Lee will have the confidence of pushing ahead with this agenda.
Bloomberg Seoul Bureau Editor Danny Thomas there with the latest from Seoul. We do have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Here's some top global headlines we're following as well. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, former prince and brother of the UK's King Charles, has been released under investigation after being arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The arrest came after further details emerged of his relationship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Mountbatten Windsor has consistently denied any wrongdoing. King Charles issued a statement outlining his deepest concern about the matter and promised Buckingham Palace's full and wholehearted support and cooperation with investigating authorities. President Trump says his Board of Peace has received roughly $17 billion in pledges toward humanitarian and reconstruction efforts in Gaza. He also says more than half a dozen countries have promised personnel for a stabilization force in the war-torn territory. The updates come as major questions remain over wresting control of the territory from Hamas, which has refused to give up its weapons. Minneapolis Fed President Neil Kashkari has accused National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett of trying to undermine Fed independence. That's after Hassett criticized the New York Fed Economist study, which found U.S. companies bear most of the burden from President Trump's tariff hikes. Kashkari defended the study, saying research conducted by Fed district banks reflects efforts to learn more about the economy.
I thought that Director Hassett's comments, though, he went on and he said that he disagreed with the results and the researchers should be punished or they should be disciplined for their conclusions. I think this is just another step to try to compromise the Fed's independence. Over the last year, we've seen multiple attempts to try to compromise the Fed's independence, including in December when the Department of Justice served a subpoena to the Board of Governors over some building expenses. It's really about monetary policy.
We actually also heard from Fed Governor Stephen Meyer dialing back some of his calls for how deeply the Fed should cut rates. And it's really that calculation that's also leading to traders in the commodity space to rethink where the Fed is going from here. Of course, we have had stronger than expected unemployment data. We are watching ahead for the Fed's preferred gauge of inflation, the PCE numbers as well. But we have seen from the FOMC minutes that several policymakers have actually discussed raising the interest rate if inflation continues to pressure the economy. And of course, we're also contending with geopolitical tensions, all of that risk premium being added to the market. So we are seeing oil prices continue to gain ground and gold, silver, precious metals moving on also calculations of where the Fed goes from here. More ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Peter Piper's pepper picking proved painful. So he ordered the supplies he needed from Amazon Business. Peter Piper picked peppers and positively prospered. Amazon Business, your partner for smart business buying. Peter Piper persistently missed packages. So he scheduled his deliveries with Amazon Business. Peter Piper picked peppers and positively prospered. Amazon Business, your partner for smart business buying.
We have breaking news out of Japan. We are getting the latest CPI numbers, growth of 1.5% for the month of January. This is a sharp deceleration from the pace that was more than 2% in the previous month. Year on year is also surpassing economists' expectations on how fast CPI is slowing down. Now, exclude fresh food for the core CPI number is growth of 2% for the month of January. Exclude energy as well, core CPI, 2.6% growth in the month of January, which is, again, a deceleration from the previous month, is also coming in much slower than economists had expected. This is really interesting because this has implications for the Bank of Japan. Of course, we have seen higher base effects from last year, softer energy costs, perhaps fewer Chinese tourists also are really putting pressure on services prices. But what does that mean for the Bank of Japan is a key question. For more on the outlook for Japan, let's bring in economy and government reporter Erika Yokoyama. Erika, as I mentioned, how can the BOJ justify its tightening path if you have inflation decelerating so fast?
Sure. Yeah,
inflation's the slowdown is pretty significant, but I actually don't think I don't think it has a much impact on the BOJ's rate hike path or the timing. Much of the slowdown is actually, as you said, driven by Takaichi's price relief measure, including utility subsidy, which kicked in January. And authorities have been kept saying that they are focused on underlying trend rather than one-off factors. And core trend still looks pretty solid actually, so big picture still remain unchanged. And in the meantime, slower inflation is a positive development as well because it can help real wages grow after they have been falling for a full year in 2025. Sustained wage growth has been one of the key elements that the BOJ has been seeking for further rate increases. So I think overall the current backdrop keeps the door open for the BOJ's rate hike as early as in April with some outside risk on March 19th.
The worry is, I guess, that fiscal tension with the Japanese government versus the BOJ. I mean, what does this potentially imply for the Japanese government, what we are seeing today from the CPI print?
Well, still today's data shows food inflation remains elevated, so I think that would add some momentum to debate over consumption tax cut that's been talking for a while. And following her landslide victory in the election earlier this month, Takaichi preached to accelerate discussion over suspending sales tax on food for 2 years. And the key question still remains, of course, how quickly the government can implement the measures and how it will be financed. And another thing Takaichi actually needs to take care in terms of price outlook is the trajectory of the currency. Some of the Takaichi remarks emphasizing the merit of weak yen previously led to the slide of the yen, right? So it has been the major driver for the inflation in Japan. And the diet session resumed today, and Takaichi will have a lot of opportunity to speak. So she will need to be really careful of her remarks not to reignite such sentiment again.
Erica, as we speak, we're seeing a perhaps knee-jerk reaction to the data and that spike in dollar yen. Thank you so much for running us through the numbers and the outlook for Japan inflation. Bloomberg Tokyo economy and government reporter Erica Yokoyama. Now, in terms of markets, it wasn't just about the geopolitical risk. The private credit fears also affecting markets overall, where we saw Blue Owl Capital saying it would restrict withdrawals from one of its retail-focused private credit funds. And the move reverses a previous plan to resume redemptions this quarter. Let's go to New York, bring in our private credit reporter, Olivia Fishlow. So, Olivia, we are seeing perhaps the background concerns coming a bit more to the fore in terms of these risks surrounding private credit, especially given their exposure to software and AI. What does all this mean for retail investors?
Yeah, definitely. It's a great question. And I think one thing that this fund really highlights is retail investors should be aware of the illiquid nature of these investments. So a lot of these private credit funds, right, they invest in loans that don't really trade, but then they sell these funds to retail investors and with the promise of some form of liquidity. And so far we've seen, Blue Owl was able to return capital to investors, but I think broadly down the line, it sort of raises the question of how do investors get money back when something like this happens to the fund?
They can periodically request redemptions, right? Give us a sense of how easy this is for retail investors to do and what the risks are around even these funds when investors flee them.
Definitely, right. So for some of these funds which don't trade publicly, investors have the option every quarter to receive money back, and that's typically limited at around 5% of the fund, which is said at the beginning when you invest in it just to protect all investors. And what we saw actually was earlier this year, this fund had redemptions beyond 5% and actually reached around 6%. And following that, Blue Owl decided to try to merge it with another public vehicle, and that later postponed that merger and scrapped it because that would have forced investors to take some losses. But so that was a solution that it had to meet the elevated redemption requests. And then now we see the new solution is to sell loans and then to return that capital to investors. So even though these funds say that, yes, there's a 5% amount that you can get every quarter, if requests go above that amount, it can be hard for the fund to fulfill those requests. And we've seen them do it so far, but I think, the question and the risk is, will this continue to be fulfilled?
Yeah, especially at a time when the likes of Bank of America is committing $25 billion of its cash for private credit deals. So perhaps this episode also a reminder, timely one of the risks in private credit. Bloomberg private credit reporter Olivia Fischler, thank you so much. We have more ahead on the Asia Trade. This is Bloomberg.
Your small business taxes handled. All your unique deductions found. Keep more money in your business and take taxes off your plate with TurboTax Expert Full Service Business.
Everywhere I go, heads turning, looking at me like, whoa, whoa, like, whoa. Everywhere I go, heads turning, looking at me like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Everywhere I go, heads turning, looking at me like, whoa.
From Hello Kitty to Demon Slayer, Japan's pop culture is now the country's second most valuable export after cars and also outpacing semiconductors. Bloomberg's been looking into the moguls turning kawaii and anime into $1 billion empires and driven Japan's self-power boom. Let's bring in Japan Equities reporter Alice French for more on this. This is really interesting, and a lot of these brands we can definitely recognize. Who stand out to you?
Yeah, morning. So look, what we kind of wanted to do with this list was bring some new names, right? I think people are quite familiar with the Sonys and the fast retailings and the Nintendos of the world, but we wanted to highlight kind of some of those names from the gaming sector and, like you say, the pop culture sector that people perhaps are not so familiar with. For me, I've obviously been covering gaming a lot from the kind of stock market perspective. So Capcom is in there, Konami is in there, Bandai Namco, also Koei Tecmo, which is actually a married couple who are in charge of the fortune, and the wife Keiko is also very, very good at picking stocks actually, and she now runs kind of the fund management arm of the company. So it's interesting to kind of see those other the diversification of these companies and how they've sort of built out their fortunes. Also, it's not just gaming and IP. This kind of Japan boom that has really kind of surged since the pandemic, partly because of the weak yen, is driven a lot by tourism, right? So we have APA in there. I think anyone who's been on a trip to Japan recently probably is familiar with their hotels. They have very reasonably priced rooms, very compact rooms, but very comfortable. Some of them even have the kind of hot spring style baths as well. So it's kind of built on that sort of live experience tourism as well as the IP.
Alice, it's really interesting, this list, because it also differs quite a fair bit from, say, people that have created wealth from heavy industry. But talk to us how exactly Japanese pop culture has become such a wealth creation engine.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think this kind of idea of cool Japan and kind of the popularity of Japanese culture is not something new, but what's really kind of boomed in the last few years is the tourism section, right? I think since COVID, we have seen this influx of numbers. We're having record numbers of tourists, coming into the country every year, partly because of the weak yen, but also I do think kind of during the pandemic and during lockdown, a lot of people did get into, Japanese pop culture, whether that be anime, gaming, manga. We were all stuck at home, right? And I think in that sense, Japanese culture really kind of came into its own. I think also the companies themselves have really been focusing on kind of global expansion and diversification, right? If you look at the gaming companies, for example, it's not just the games and the consoles that they're making. They're branching out into, things like figurines, doing collaborations with other brands, really, going hard on social media and things, producing more kind of English language content to kind of speak to the global audience. And of course, course, the backdrop for all of this is the historically weak yen that we've seen over the past couple of years. I know we've seen it strengthen a little bit in the last few weeks, but it's still very weak, and it's cheap to travel here, right? And that has definitely boosted the popularity of Japan as a whole.
Alice French, Bloomberg's Japan equities reporter. Great story. Do check it out. The billionaires behind Japan's cultural icons. Let's actually talk more about Japan's growing and resurgent, perhaps soft power. With us now is Matt Alt, author of Pure Invention: How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World. Matt, great to have you in studio here.
Pleasure.
Why is Japanese products, Japanese IP so popular in the world?
Well, Japanese products are popular around the world not simply because they're well made, but also, I believe, because they answer questions that a lot of the outside world hadn't thought to ask yet. Japan hit certain milestones of what you might call post-industrial nations ahead of the societies outside of the world in the West. And so the products that it started to make in the post-war era, the karaoke machine, Walkmans, video games for adults, comic books, manga, anime, all of this sort of thing appealed to audiences that were not being served well in the Western markets.
Everything that you listed right now, manga, video games, this IP, everything related to Hello Kitty. How viable is this intellectual property in an age of artificial intelligence when anybody can just fake it out there?
There are grave dangers to the Japanese content production sector now posed by AI. And fortunately in Japan, the authorities have taken note of this. Even though the Japanese government has stated that they want to make Japan one of the world's most friendly countries to AI development, they know that they can't do this without putting protections in place for the creators that make the content that are becoming a sort of pillar for the Japanese economy right now. So there are being guardrails put in place to preclude AI companies from training on Japanese content or producing content that resembles too closely things coming out of Japan. But it is a fact right now that many of the big AI companies are training their large language models on Japanese content.
And this is a global issue, isn't it?
This is absolutely a global issue.
Which needs more coordination with other governments as well. How well has Japan done that? Also, in terms of distributing their products and content overseas?
I think Japanese companies are very good at finding partners abroad who understand the local sorts of environments where the products are sold. Traditionally, that's how the Japanese content producers have handled this. They've taken a largely hands-off approach. That's been changing in recent years. We've seen a lot of consolidations in the Japanese entertainment sector, with companies such as Toho acquiring distributors abroad and making pipelines that they can deliver the content directly to consumers abroad. I think this is one of the biggest shifts in what you might call the cool Japan delivery strategy, where we're specifically seeing Japanese companies reaching out to foreign audiences with nobody in between.
Matt, it's really interesting because I remember a time where it was really the heyday of J-pop, and then K-pop kind of took over, and then we're seeing a bit of a resurgence in J-pop at the moment. Talk to us about perhaps how these two differ in a way, or are there similarities?
I think one of the biggest differences between Japan and Korea in this front is that the Korean government is much more aggressive about supporting its content production industries than Japan is. And then you also see other issues. In Japan, traditionally, content rights owners would actually have content taken down from places like YouTube. So there wasn't a way for consumers abroad to really consume J-pop in the way that they could K-pop. Now we're seeing a really interesting resurgence of Japanese pop music in the form of the background music and the title songs for animated series. So there's a kind of backdoor that these Japanese musicians and content producers are using to get and win hearts and minds abroad.
Peter Piper's pepper picking proved painful. So he ordered the supplies he needed from Amazon Business.
Peter Piper picked peppers to run.
And positively prospered. Amazon Business, your partner for smart business buying. Peter Piper's pepper picking proved painful. So he ordered the supplies he needed from Amazon Business.
Peter Piper picked peppers to run.
And positively prospered. Amazon Business, your partner for smart business buying.
So with that in mind, and perhaps some of the challenges related to IP for Japanese companies, how do you think they can strategize and exactly expand, capitalize on their culture capital, so to speak?
I've spoken to a lot of content producers in Japan in the film, television, manga, anime, and toy production worlds, and one of the number one things that I have heard is to focus on the home market first. People love things from Japan because they're Japanese, and so when Japanese creators try to appeal to Western audiences, they often slip up. So you're seeing now a kind of, in a good way, an inward focus, a focus on the internal market and what Japanese audiences like tends to be what foreign audiences like now, because audiences around the world who have been raised on so much Japanese pop culture have now synchronized their tastes with the Japanese marketplace. So I think there's a very fertile ground for expansion abroad, with Japanese producers doing exactly what they've been doing for the last 50 to 60 years.
How supportive is the Japanese government in helping all of that? Because you mentioned how the Koreans are doing it very well, but when it comes to not only just IP, but the entertainment industry overall, even production of movies, for example.
Well, Prime Minister Takaichi has pledged to raise the amount of money that the Japanese government is using to help promote Japanese products. And we are seeing this not only in the form of the promotion of the products themselves, but also in the support of all of the businesses that go into making the products, such as not only animating, but translating, localizing, all of these sort of ancillary services. So finally, the Japanese government seems to have woken up to the fact that if you don't fertilize this garden, so to speak, it won't grow.
And the issue with trying to promote your country's products is also that when your country has geopolitical issues with other countries, they're at risk. How effective has the separation been when it comes to geopolitics, the tensions with China, with just cultural content of Japan, or have they been hit together?
Well, if you put all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak, and you are using tourism as one of your main pillars of economic growth, anything that you do that upsets people around you has a potential to kind of damage that growth. And in particular, Japan has, I think, succeeded in a big way by staying out of the headlines in a lot of ways. Japan used to be, in the 1980s, when I was growing up, a kind of economic tiger. In my country, in my home country of America, there was a lot of what was called Japan bashing. But after the Japanese economy crashed and the bubble burst, Japan kind of faded out of the headlines. And that turned into, ironically, a great strength of Japan. It became this blank slate that people could project their own attitudes and values upon. The more Japan manifests itself in the geopolitical sphere, the more that Japan starts to take an active role in military, economic, and geopolitical sorts of strategies and things like that, the bigger a danger there is that it is going to lose its soft power, that it is going to lose the kind of cultural charisma that it's built up over the years. It's a very delicate balance.
Great perspective, Matt Alt. Really good to have you with us, author of Pure Invention, here in our Tokyo studio. And of course, we're talking about J content. We'll talk about K content as well. Fans of the Netflix animated film K-pop Demon Hunters are in for a long wait for the sequel. The streaming giant finalized deals for a second movie with Sony Pictures Animation, the studio that developed the demon-slashing hit. But creator Maggie Kang told Bloomberg exclusively not to expect an encore to hit screens anytime soon.
Oh, I don't know what I will do next. I really don't. But I can't really share that at the moment. But
there's a sequel, surely.
I mean, I can't really say that officially, but I would say I would be shocked. I mean, in a world where that loves sequels, I don't think it's a surprise that something else could be coming. But I don't know. It's going to be a long wait for anything, unfortunately.
Why?
Animation just takes a long time. It's just...
Well, does it have to be animation? What about a live-action version?
I really think there's so much that the animation medium brings to the film, the tone of the movie, the types of characters that we were able to create, the type of comedy that we were able to push, the drama. So I firmly believe that the movie couldn't have seen the success if it was live action.
And you can watch the full conversation between Maggie Kang and Michelle Hussein on Bloomberg.com/videos or listen wherever you get your podcasts. A reminder of our new online feature, the Bloomberg Video Hub. Subscribers can explore live streaming, news, interviews, all our Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, report analysis, and more. Check out Bloomberg.com/videos. This is Bloomberg.
Want to talk business? Meet me in the onboard lounge.
For more than 75 years, we've been giving professionals the tools and opportunities to move finance forward. Because the future of finance depends on the standards of those ready to lead it. CFA Institute.
The latest from the corporate front, Netflix co-CEO Ted Sarandos says the streaming giant's bid to acquire Warner Brothers Discovery will offer great value to shareholders of both companies. He says a merger would lead to more films in theaters if the deal goes through, addressing a key complaint from Hollywood. Netflix is vying with Paramount Skydance to buy Warner's studios and streaming business.
We will have a positive impact on the business for the long term. Remember, what we're doing in buying these assets is even creating original programming on Netflix for about a decade.
Just teaching an engineering class for fun.
Incredible IP. We just happen to have a
one quick second.
maximize the returns on that IP.